A millionaire used to luxury sees his life turned upside down when he fulfills his father's last request, to live as an ordinary man. Lost in New York, he meets Sophia, a woman who challenges him to see the world differently. Subscribe to our channel so you don't miss out on more exciting stories like this one, and like the video to keep watching. A fine mist enveloped the skyscrapers of London, blurring the exact outlines of the buildings. The lights high above twinkled like artificial stars, reflecting in the flawless glass of the city's most luxurious penthouse. Inside the main hall, a solitary figure stood in front of an immense panoramic window. Alexander Hunt, heir to one of Europe's greatest fortunes, wore an impeccably cut suit as light grey as the English winter sky. In his hand, a glass of red wine swayed slightly. He looked like a statue, a portrait of perfection and power, but anyone who looked at him closely would see that his eyes were fixed on nothing. Outside, London was alive, pulsating, but for Alexander, everything seemed motionless. His impeccable appearance was just the surface. Young, handsome, a millionaire, Alexander was the kind of man people idolized and envied in equal measure. He had mansions on several continents, a yacht moored in Monaco, and a busy schedule of parties, engagements, and people always saying yes. But the buzz of laughter and music echoing through the corridors of his penthouse couldn't drown out what he felt inside. A deaf loneliness, like the echo of an empty room. The restrained sound of footsteps on marble made Alexander turn slightly. It was his butler, a man with a posture as firm as it was respectful. "Mr. Hunt," the butler began. "Your father is on the line. He insists on speaking to you." Alexander narrowed his eyes and twirled his glass between his fingers. "Tell him I'll call him back tomorrow." The tone was indifferent, as if he hadn't listened properly. "He said it was urgent, sir." Alexander's expression hardened, but something in the butler's tone, or perhaps in the weight of that word, urgent, made him put the glass down on the side table. Unhurriedly, he walked over to the landline in the corner of the room, the sound of his footsteps muffled by the carpet. "Dad," Alexander said when he answered, his voice neutral, almost bored. "It's late. What's wrong?" "I need you to come here now, Alexander." The voice on the other end was hoarse, marked by tiredness. Alexander looked at the watch on his wrist. It was past midnight. "Can't it wait until tomorrow?" "No, I can't." The answer was short, but carried undeniable weight. For a moment, Alexander thought about arguing, but something stopped him. With a heavy sigh, he grabbed his coat and left. The road to the Hunt mansion, on the outskirts of London, was surrounded by trees with skeletal branches that stretched towards the sky. The winding road seemed longer than usual that night. The full moon, hidden among the clouds, illuminated the stone mansion that loomed like a shadowy fortress in the distance. When he arrived, Alexander walked straight through the foyer and up the marble stairs to his father's study. As he entered, he immediately felt the heavy atmosphere. The fireplace crackled softly, but it couldn't dispel the chill. Thomas Hunt was sitting in his leather chair, his pale skin contrasting with the dark details of the furniture. His eyes, clear and penetrating, rose from the book he was holding. "You've come." Thomas's voice was calm but firm. "I thought it was something urgent," Alexander replied impatiently. "But you look well enough to read." Thomas closed the book slowly, each gesture laden with intention. He pointed to the chair in front of the table. "Have a seat." Alexander hesitated but obeyed. "If this is about the company merger, I've already taken care of everything. There's nothing to worry about." Thomas shook his head slowly. "It's not about business. It's about you." His voice carried a gravity that Alexander couldn't ignore. "What about me?" Alexander asked, suspicious. Thomas took a deep breath, the expression on his aged face hardening. "I'm dying." The silence that followed seemed to compress the air. The wood in the fireplace crackled, and the windows rattled slightly in the wind outside. Alexander kept his face still, but inside he felt a spark of discomfort. "You can't just call me here in the middle of the night to say that." "It's the truth." Thomas leaned forward, his eyes firmly on his son. "I've spent my life building this fortune, this name, this legacy, but it's all empty and purposeless. And you live attached to it as if it were an anchor. It doesn't make sense." Alexander leaned back, crossing his arms. What do you want from me? I want you to do something for me. Thomas hesitated for a moment before continuing. Travel to New York. Go with no money, no cards, no Hunt surname. Live like an ordinary man for a while. Alexander let out a cold, almost incredulous laugh. You've got to be kidding. I'm not. Thomas leaned even closer, his eyes watering. It's my last request. The sound of those words, spoken with such vulnerability, reverberated in Alexander's mind. He wanted to refuse, he wanted to argue, but something about his father, about the way he seemed so human, so fragile, made Alexander hesitate. The anger he felt at first began to turn into something harder to name, a mixture of curiosity and fear. Why? He asked, his voice lower. Thomas sighed, leaning back in his chair. Because a man's value lies not in what he has, but in what he does. I want you to see the world from another angle, Alexander, before it's too late. The cold London wind seemed more biting that night. Alexander still felt the weight of his father's words echoing in his mind as the car glided through the dark streets back to its penthouse. I'm dying. He gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles whitening. Never in his life had he felt anything like it, a solid, suffocating knot that seemed to form in his stomach, slowly rising up to his throat. Thomas Hunt was more than a father to Alexander. He was the architect of his entire life. He was the man who shaped his childhood with lessons in strength and control, who trained him never to show weakness. Now, the thought of losing him was like watching an imposing marble statue crumble to dust right before your eyes. As the car sped through the illuminated streets, Alexander felt a strange warmth on his eyelids. He blinked rapidly. No, I'm not going to cry, he thought, clenching his jaw. Crying was a weakness, and weakness wasn't part of what Thomas Hunt had taught him. When he reached the penthouse, Alexander entered the apartment, but the atmosphere seemed different. The sound of the party still going on, the muffled laughter, the clinking glasses, everything seemed distant, disconnected. He passed people without even noticing their faces, as if they were shadows, until he reached the panoramic window again. There he finally shed his coat and let himself sink into a leather armchair. The image of her father, aged and vulnerable in the leather office chair, kept popping into her head. The hoarse, fragile voice still echoed, snapping Alexander out of his usual state of security. For the first time he felt small, insignificant. He closed his eyes and inhaled deeply, but the pressure in his chest only increased. The thought of a life without Thomas was unbearable. More than the fear of losing his father, Alexander felt the discomfort of facing a truth he had avoided all his life. His father wasn't eternal, and he himself didn't know who he was without him. Doubt gnawed at him. Why is he asking me to do this? What does he want to prove? The next morning, Alexander woke up before sunrise. The penthouse was silent now, the remnants of the party scattered across the floor like souvenirs from the night before. He got out of bed, his hair messy and the dark circles under his eyes revealing his almost sleepless night. It wasn't his habit to look sloppy, but something had changed. In the silence of the apartment, Alexander's mind wandered. He thought back to the years when he had lived in his father's shadow, meeting his expectations, building a legacy that was not his, but Thomas Hunt's. He remembered the business trips he took as a teenager, the lessons in control and discipline. His father always said, "Alexander, the world is not kind. You must master it before it swallows you up." These words, which once seemed like an absolute truth, now sounded empty, as if somehow his father's request had torn the veil off his reality. In the afternoon, Alexander drove back to the mansion. The icy wind was blowing hard, making the trees at the entrance to the estate bow as if in reverence to something invisible. When he entered the study again, Thomas was exactly where he had left him the night before, but he looked even more fragile. "Dad." Alexander closed the door behind him, his voice lower than usual. Thomas looked at him, and for the first time Alexander noticed something in his father's eyes that he had never noticed before. Tiredness. Not the kind of tiredness of someone who has had a long day, but that of someone who has carried the world on his back for decades. "Have you thought about what I said?" asked Thomas, leaning back slightly in his chair. Alexander sighed, running a hand through his hair as he walked over to the window. He stared out at the impeccably tended garden, where dry leaves danced in the wind. "Why are you doing this?" Alexander's voice sounded almost like a whisper. "Why ask me something so absurd? I'm a hunt. We're bigger than that." Thomas laughed, but it was a bitter, almost sarcastic laugh. "Bigger than that? Alexander, you're trapped in an illusion. Money is not greatness. Wealth is not purpose." Alexander turned to his father, his face marked by a mixture of confusion and frustration. "I've lived the life you wanted me to live. I did everything the way you taught me. Why now do you want to throw me out into the middle of nowhere like some random? What kind of lesson is that?" Thomas looked up, his breathing slow and heavy. "Because you need to learn to be a man, Alexander. Not a hunt, not a millionaire, but a real man. And a man only finds out who he really is when he has nothing to hide behind." For a moment, neither of them said anything. Alexander felt the ground beneath him become less firm. What his father was asking went against everything he had learned, against the entire foundation of his life. He wanted to refuse, to shout, to protest. But there was something in Thomas's tone that he couldn't ignore. Finally, Alexander took a deep breath, his hands trembling at his sides. He hated to admit it, but he was afraid, not of running out of money, but of discovering what he would find when he looked at himself. "All right," he said, his voice firm but his eyes full of emotion. "I'll go, but don't expect me to come back thanking you for it." Thomas smiled slightly, but it wasn't a smile of victory. It was a smile of acceptance. The London airport terminal was packed, but Alexander looked out of place. He wore simple clothes, dark jeans and a worn leather jacket, nothing to give away his wealth or status. In his hands, a small suitcase unmarked by luxury. As he waited to board, he looked at the ticket in his hands. One way to New York. The thought of getting on that plane with nothing but a little cash, and without his surname to open doors, was terrifying. When the flight was called, Alexander hesitated. He looked out of the window at the city that had always been his stronghold. For a moment he thought about throwing the ticket in the trash and going back to his penthouse, where the wine awaited him, and the parties never ended. But then his father's face appeared in his mind, the tired look, the firm voice. "A man's worth is not in what he has, but in what he does." Swallowing dryly, Alexander stood up. Each step towards the gate felt like an act of defiance against himself, but he kept going, and for the first time in his life, Alexander Hunt was about to become nobody. New York was a chaos that seemed alive. People were rushing around, dodging each other. Horns echoed like uninterrupted screams, and the fluorescent lights of stores and advertisements flashed in all directions. For Alexander, this was a completely different world, a jungle he didn't understand, and where, for the first time, no one knew who he was. He pulled his small suitcase, crossing the streets aimlessly. There were no plans, no destination, just the overwhelming certainty that he had nowhere to go. The cold cut his face like little blades, and his simple clothes were not enough to protect him. He shrugged his shoulders, feeling incredibly vulnerable, as if the city could devour him at any moment. He walked for hours, passing hotels whose shiny facades reminded him of the life he had left behind. He wanted to go in, he wanted to ask for a room, but he knew he couldn't afford it. Not now. With his hands freezing, he found refuge in a cheap hostel, miles from anything that could be called comfort. The musty smell and decaying atmosphere hit him like a punch in the stomach as soon as he crossed the threshold. The tired-looking man at reception didn't even look at him twice before handing over the key to a shared room. Climbing the narrow, worn stairs, Alexander felt the weight of each step. Everything was different. It was dirty, strange, and oppressive. When he opened the door to his room, he saw 3 cramped bunk beds and people who didn't even bother to look at him. One of the men, with unkempt hair and a smell of cheap cigarettes, snorted when Alexander entered, as if his presence was just another nuisance. He dropped his suitcase next to a thin mattress and sank into it, feeling a lump in his throat. The sound of snoring and footsteps echoing in the corridor kept him awake for hours. He wasn't Alexander Hunt there, the powerful heir, the man who had the world at his feet. He was nobody. At dawn, Alexander left the hostel aimlessly. He walked through the busy streets, trying to find something that made sense, but the city seemed to laugh at him at every turn. He went into a cafe and ordered a simple coffee. When he heard the price, he felt ridiculous as he realized that the little money he had would quickly be consumed by something so trivial. He sat by the window holding the hot cup as if it were an anchor while he watched the people outside. They were walking fast, talking loudly, laughing, fighting. They all seemed to have a purpose. He didn't. For the first time, he began to understand what his father meant. He didn't know what it was to live. In the late afternoon, wandering through a square in Lower Manhattan, Alexander tripped on a step and the suitcase he was pulling overturned. Everything fell to the ground, some clothes, a book, and an empty notebook that he didn't even remember putting there. Hurriedly, he bent down to pick things up, feeling his face flush with the shame of being in that situation. Then he heard a voice. "Do you need help?" He looked up and saw a woman standing in front of him, already crouching down to pick up her notebook. She had her dark hair up in a loose bun and was wearing a red coat that was visibly old but looked comfortable. Her brown eyes stared at him with an intensity that made him hesitate for a moment. "I'm fine," he said, trying to sound firm, but his voice didn't sound convincing even to himself. "You don't look it," she replied, handing him the notebook with a half smile. Alexander took the notebook, embarrassed. "I guess I'm a bit lost." She arched an eyebrow as if trying to decipher him. "Lost like without knowing where you are? Or lost like in life?" He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Maybe both." She seemed to consider her answer for a moment before standing up and holding out her hand to help him up too. "I'm Sophia. I live around here." "Alexander," he replied, accepting her hand and standing up. She looked him up and down. "Where are you from? Because clearly you're not from around here." "London. I'm trying something new." Sophia crossed her arms, tilting her head. "Something new? Did you come to New York without knowing what to do?" "Something like that." She smiled, but there was a hint of skepticism on her face. "Well, good luck with that, tourist." She took a step towards leaving, but Alexander, driven by something he himself didn't understand, called out to her. "Hold on. Do you know anywhere I can get a job?" Sophia turned around in surprise. "A job?" "Yes, something temporary." She narrowed her eyes, as if trying to understand why someone like him would need something like that. Finally, she shrugged. "Maybe. But honestly, you seem a bit out of your element." He gave a half-hearted smile, silently admitting that she was right. "I'm trying to change that." She smiled slightly, took out a piece of paper and wrote down an address. "Try here. It's a small restaurant. It won't pay you much, but if you can stand it, it's a start." He took the paper, thanking her sincerely. "Thank you, Sophia." "Don't thank me yet. Working in New York is no joke. Good luck, outsider." And with that, she disappeared into the crowd, leaving Alexander with the paper in his hand and a strange feeling that this encounter had been more meaningful than he could understand. The restaurant was nothing like the places Alexander frequented. The walls were painted a faded yellow, and the smell of hot oil seemed to permeate everything. The manager, a stout man with a tired expression, didn't even raise his eyes when he spoke to him. "Do you have any experience?" the man asked, scribbling something on a notepad. Alexander hesitated. "I'm willing to learn." The manager looked up, assessing him for a moment. "Right. Start tomorrow." As Alexander left the restaurant, he felt a chill in his stomach. Not because of the work, but for the simple fact that for the first time, he was about to do something he had never done before, earn his own living. He walked back to the hostel with slow steps, feeling the weight of the night fall on him. Through the window, he could see the lights of New York twinkling like stars, but now they seemed further away than ever. The day dawned with a grey sky over New York, and Alexander was already feeling the weight of his new life. The hostel, with its stuffy, noisy corridors, seemed like a scene of suffocating abandonment. He put on the same shabby jacket he had worn the day before, grabbed a cheap coffee on the corner, and walked to the restaurant with the address Sophia had given him. His hands were shaking, not so much from the cold, but from the anxiety of what was to come. He, Alexander Hunt, who had already closed billion-dollar deals in luxurious rooms, was now about to start as a helper in a corner restaurant. When he arrived, the restaurant was already up and running. Outside, the smell of oil and fried food already permeated the air. There was nothing welcoming about it. The facade was simple. The plastic tables scattered around the room looked clumsy, and the people behind the counter didn't smile. The manager, the same stout man with a tired expression who had hired him the day before, saw him coming in and pointed to the kitchen without even saying, "Good morning." Alexander swallowed his pride and followed. The kitchen was cramped and noisy, with fumes from boiling pots and the constant sound of sizzling pans. He was quickly introduced to his tasks, washing dishes, organizing orders, and eventually waiting tables. There was no training, no detailed instructions. Just quick, straightforward instructions while the other staff moved with the efficiency of someone who had been doing it for years. Alexander was out of sync. On his very first order, he knocked over an entire tray of glasses as he walked to one of the tables. The sound of glass shattering on the floor made everyone in the kitchen stop for a second. The manager stared at him with a mixture of irritation and tiredness, but didn't shout. Instead, he handed him a broom without saying anything. It was worse than if he had been reprimanded. The silence of disappointment was deafening. The shift seemed endless. His hands, used to holding gold pens and crystal goblets, were red and rough from scrubbing plates and trays. The heat of the kitchen and the sweat on his forehead made him uncomfortable, and he could smell the grease sticking to his clothes. When he finally managed to get out for a break, he sat in the alley behind the restaurant eating a sandwich the manager had given him. It didn't taste of anything. He stood there looking at the brick walls around him, wondering how he had gotten to this point. As he chewed slowly, his mind went back to the last conversation he'd had with his father. He could clearly hear Thomas's voice saying, "A man's worth is not in what he has, but in what he does." At that moment, Alexander felt a pang of anger. What exactly was he supposed to be learning there? He was covered in sweat, with wounded pride and no prospects. Was this what his father wanted? For him to fail again and again until he felt useless? His thoughts were interrupted by a voice he hadn't expected to hear. "So, how are you doing in your new job?" asked Sophia, leaning against the door of the alleyway. Alexander almost choked on his sandwich. "Sophia, what are you doing here?" She shrugged, smiling. "I come here for lunch sometimes. The manager is a client of mine. He rented his apartment from me last year." She crossed her arms, her smile wider now. "But I didn't know you'd actually take the job." He sighed, wiping his hands on a napkin and getting up. "I'm adapting." "I guess you are." She looked at him, analyzing the sauce stains on his shirt and the tired look in his eyes. "I'm not going to lie, you look different." Alexander tried to laugh, but there wasn't much humor there. "I guess different is a polite word for destroyed." "Well, it's part of the process." Sophia shrugged. "Did you know what you were getting into?" "Not exactly. I didn't think so." She watched him for a moment, and then her expression softened. "You should try to look at it another way. It may seem awful now, but there's value in learning what it's like to live like this." "Value?" He laughed bitterly. "I don't see much value in getting covered in grease and washing dishes." Sophia took a serious step forward. "Maybe the value is in the people around you, Alexander. Have you noticed them, or are you too busy feeling sorry for yourself?" Her words hit him like a punch. He opened his mouth to reply, but she was already walking away, back into the restaurant. Alexander stood there in the alley, processing what she had said. It was true. He hadn't really been paying attention to anyone. When he returned to the restaurant, he began to observe more. There was Maria, the waitress who worked too fast, probably to earn enough tips to support her children. There was Tony, the middle-aged cook with tattooed arms, who shouted orders in the kitchen but still found time to laugh with the other staff. And there was the manager, who looked as exhausted as everyone else, but who cleaned the tables at the end of the day with the same dedication as any employee. Alexander realized that these people lived in a completely different world from his. They didn't work to find a purpose or to prove something to themselves. They worked because they needed to survive. It was simple and brutal, and he had never understood it until that moment. At the end of the day, as he was leaving the restaurant, physical tiredness hit him overwhelmingly. His legs ached, his back felt like it was made of stone, and all he wanted to do was collapse on his bed in the hostel. But as he walked, he felt something different. It was almost imperceptible, like a spark. He realized that he had survived. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't easy, but he made it through the day. Back at the hostel, Alexander lay on the narrow bed, staring at the peeling ceiling. The sounds in the room were still the same: snores, footsteps, the hum of a television somewhere. But now he didn't feel so suffocated. Maybe Sophia was right. Maybe there was something to learn from it all. Over the next few days, he began to adapt, but not without difficulties. He broke more plates, got scolded by Tony, and suffered from rude customers. In a moment of distraction, he spilled hot coffee on the counter and almost got fired. The constant humiliation seemed to strip away layers of his former arrogance. He began to listen more and talk less. From time to time, Sophia would appear in the restaurant, always with a teasing comment or a quick smile. It was a reminder that someone believed he could do it, even when he didn't believe in himself. One evening, after a particularly difficult shift, Alexander found Sophia sitting on a bench outside the restaurant. Without knowing why, he sat down next to her. "I'm beginning to understand what you meant," he said, after a long silence. "About what?" she asked, without taking her eyes off the horizon. "About people. And value." She finally looked at him, surprised by the sincerity in his voice. "That's a good start, Alexander." He smiled slightly, feeling that perhaps he was finally taking the first step towards something he couldn't name. Days at the restaurant started to become a routine for Alexander, but the adjustment wasn't easy. He was still tripping over his own feet, getting orders wrong, facing judgmental looks from the manager, and complaints from impatient customers. Every day seemed like a test of emotional and physical endurance. He would wake up early, walk to work in the biting cold, and return exhausted to the hostel where the nights were noisy and sleepless. For the first time in his life, he felt what it was like to be consumed by fatigue, the kind that starts in the body and seeps into the mind. The restaurant kitchen was an orchestra of chaos, and he still didn't know the tune. Tony, the cook, was shouting orders while moving pans around as if he were on a battlefield. Maria, the waitress, glided between the tables like a hurricane, balancing crowded trays and exchanging smiles with customers. Alexander tried to keep up, but always seemed a step behind. On that particular day, a demanding customer seemed to have decided that Alexander would be his target. He was about 50 years old, with a well-cut suit and a disdainful expression that Alexander knew well. It was the kind of person he himself used to be. When Alexander served the order, his trembling hands caused the glass of water to spill slightly on the table. "Are you kidding?" complained the man, pushing back his chair. "Is this restaurant service or amateur?" Alexander quickly tried to clean up the mess, but the customer kept grumbling, raising his voice with every sentence. "Can't even hold a glass properly? How do you get a job like that?" The whole restaurant seemed to have stopped. Everyone was looking in their direction. Alexander felt the heat creeping up his neck, his hands sweaty. He wanted to answer. He wanted to give it back, but the words died in his throat. Instead, he put his head down and wiped the table in silence. When he returned to the kitchen, Tony was standing by the stove, looking at him with raised eyebrows. "Are you going to let him talk to you like that?" asked Tony, his voice hoarse. "What else could I do?" Alexander replied, trying to hide his frustration. "You could have said something, or at least shown that you're not made of stone. You don't have to swallow everything." "I'm not one for confrontation," lied Alexander, drying his hands on a cloth. "Oh yes, you look like you've never had a fight in your life, all calm and zen," Tony teased, laughing. "Look, kid, this job isn't just about washing dishes and waiting tables. It's about learning to swallow your pride sometimes, and at other times, knowing when not to." Alexander didn't reply. The humiliation was still fresh, but he knew Tony was right. He was there to learn, and learning meant accepting that not everything would turn out the way he wanted. That evening, after a particularly difficult shift, Alexander was clearing the tables when he heard a familiar laugh. He looked towards the entrance of the restaurant and saw Sophia sitting on one of the stools near the counter. She was laughing at something Maria had said, while absent-mindedly swirling a mug of coffee in her hands. Alexander hesitated for a moment, but went over to her, pulling a cloth from his pocket to wipe down the next table. "I should start worrying about you being here so often," he said, trying to sound casual. Sophia looked up, smiling slightly. Maybe I just like the food here. I find that hard to believe. And why do you think that? Because no one comes here for the food, he replied without holding back a smile. She laughed and shrugged. Okay, maybe it's the atmosphere. Ambiance? He looked around, gesturing at the worn chairs and yellowed walls. You're a terrible liar. Sophia laughed louder this time, attracting glances from Tony and Maria, who whispered something while laughing too. Maybe I'll come because it's fun to see how you're coping, Sophia admitted. Alexander arched an eyebrow. Dealing with what? With life, or what they call real life. Alexander took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her words. He wanted to say that he was doing well, that he was learning and adapting, but the truth was more complicated. He felt that he was constantly failing, that each day was harder than the last. Honestly, I don't know if I'm dealing with anything, he finally admitted. I think I'm just trying to survive. Sophia watched him for a moment, as if analyzing his words. That's something, she said with a softer tone. He tilted his head, puzzled. You always talk as if you know exactly what you're doing, as if you had everything sorted out. I don't, she replied quickly, her smile diminishing. Alexander noticed the change in her tone but didn't want to press the issue. Well, you seem to be one step ahead of me, at least. Maybe, but that doesn't mean much. She left some money on the counter and stood up. See you, Alexander. And with that she left. But as Alexander watched her walk away through the window, he couldn't help thinking about what she had said. Sophia seemed charged with a strength that he still didn't understand. But there was also something behind that strength, something she was hiding. The days passed, and Alexander began to pay more attention to everything around him. He started talking to Maria, who talked about her 2 young children and the effort she made to pay the rent. She smiled constantly, but her eyes showed the weariness of someone who never had a choice. Tony, on the other hand, was rude and direct, but Alexander began to realize that behind all the sarcasm, he cared. He made jokes with everyone, but he was also always willing to help when someone needed it. And there was Sophia, who appeared in the restaurant from time to time, always with a new tease or a smile that made Alexander wonder why she seemed to care. He began to realize that, even without meaning to, she was becoming his anchor in the chaos. One night, while resting in the hostel, Alexander picked up the empty notebook that had fallen out of his suitcase the day he met Sophia. He opened it and began to write, almost without thinking. It wasn't something he usually did, but the words just flowed. He wrote about work, about Tony, Maria, and above all about Sophia. He wrote about how she seemed so sure of herself, but at the same time full of secrets. He wrote about the client who humiliated him, about how he felt anger but also shame. He wrote about his father and the phrase he couldn't get out of his head. The value of a man is not in what he has, but in what he does. When she had finished, she closed her notebook and looked up at the ceiling. For the first time, he felt he was beginning to understand what it all meant. The pride he carried was being destroyed, piece by piece. And in the void that this left, something new was beginning to form. Perhaps it was resilience. Maybe it was humanity. He didn't know for sure, but he felt he was changing. The restaurant was packed that night. It was a Saturday, and the small space seemed even smaller, with loud voices overlapping the sound of clashing plates and glasses. The smell of hot grease and spicy sauces permeated the air, and Alexander, his shirt already sticking to his body with sweat, tried to balance himself between the cramped tables. The kitchen was working at a frenetic pace, with Tony shouting out orders with characteristic impatience, while Maria ran between customers with a smile on her face, even though her eyes bore the fatigue of long days and sleepless nights. Alexander had just finished serving an order when he noticed a customer sitting at one of the tables in the corner waving at him impatiently. He was a middle-aged man, dressed in an expensive suit, sporting a shiny watch and an arrogant look that Alexander knew well. It was the kind of man he used to be. He approached the table with a notepad and a visible effort to appear calm. "Do you need anything?" he asked, trying to sound professional. The man gave Alexander a long look, as if assessing him. "Yes, I need this dish made. It's cold," he said, pushing the plate aside. Alexander looked at the plate. It was still steaming, clearly freshly served. "Sir, I can assure you that it just came out of the kitchen," said Alexander, choosing his words carefully. "Are you calling me a liar?" replied the man, his voice rising a tone. "Of course not, sir. Just nothing," cut the customer off, crossing his arms. "I want a new dish. And this time, bring decent service. You know, if I were in a real restaurant, this would never happen." Alexander's breathing became heavy. He felt the blood rush to his face, an irritating heat that made him want to respond. Every fiber of his being screamed for him to put him in his place, to show that, in a world where money talked, Alexander Hunt was at the top. But he wasn't Alexander Hunt there. He was just Alexander, a faceless waiter dealing with a difficult customer. He swallowed, picked up his plate and went back to the kitchen. "Problems?" asked Tony, watching Alexander curiously. "Arrogant customer?" he replied dryly. "Welcome to my world," Tony said with a hoarse laugh before returning to stirring a frying pan. While he waited for the new dish to be ready, Alexander leaned against the worktop, trying to calm the turmoil inside him. Part of him wanted to throw it all away, to abandon a life that seemed like an endless string of humiliations and hardships. What was he trying to prove anyway? He could get on a plane back to London and end it all. But deep down there was another part, a more subtle voice that he couldn't ignore. It was his father's voice. It was the memory of Sophia, of Maria, of Tony. It was the realization that perhaps there was a greater purpose to it all. Later that evening, when the customers had left and the restaurant was quiet, Alexander saw Sophia sitting on the bench outside as she occasionally did. The night air was cool, and she seemed immersed in her thoughts. He hesitated for a moment before joining her. "Another day in paradise," he said, trying to ease the tension with humor. Sophia smiled sideways but didn't reply immediately. "It seems that today was difficult for you," she said at last, looking at him. "And how do you know?" "I saw the look on your face when that customer started complaining. You looked like you were about to explode." Alexander sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It was hard, but I didn't explode, did I?" "No, you didn't explode. That's something." He looked at her, puzzled. "You always look on the bright side, don't you?" Sophia gave him a small smile, but there was something sad about it. "Not always, but I try." "How do you do it?" he asked, his voice lower now. She was silent for a moment, looking at the city lights in the distance. "I think I've learned to survive that way. My father used to say that if life knocks you down, you can complain or you can get up and get on with it." He was a hard man, but he wasn't wrong. Alexander noticed that there was a sadness in her voice, something he still didn't fully understand. "I guess he taught you well." Sophia shrugged. "Maybe. But sometimes moving on isn't as simple as it seems." Alexander wanted to ask more. He wanted to know what was behind that strength and that pain. But something stopped him. Maybe it was the fear of seeming nosy, or maybe it was because he knew he was also hiding things he wasn't ready to reveal. The next few days passed in a blur of work and exhaustion. Alexander continued to struggle with his own limitations, but he was beginning to realize that he was learning, albeit slowly. He no longer knocked over trays as often, began to memorize orders, and surprisingly even exchanged a few words with the regulars. But behind the progress there was a shadow he couldn't ignore. He was getting closer to Sophia, and that scared him. The more he got to know her, the more he realized that she was unlike anyone he had ever met. She was strong and resilient, but she also carried a vulnerability that made her real. And he, Alexander Hunt, was lying to her. Every time he thought about telling the truth, something held him back. The fear that Sophia would see him as an imposter, as someone who didn't deserve to be there, was paralyzing. And so he continued to live that lie, even though he knew he was building a time bomb that would eventually explode. The explosion happened unexpectedly. It was a busy night at the restaurant, and Alexander was rushing to take tables when he heard a familiar voice behind him. He froze. He didn't need to turn around to know who it was. "Alexander Hunt? Is that you?" When he finally turned around, he saw a tall man in an elegant suit standing at the entrance to the restaurant. It was James Parker, an old business colleague from London. "I can't believe it's you," said James, approaching with a broad smile. "What are you doing here?" Alexander's blood ran cold. He tried to disguise it by wiping his hands on his apron. I'm just spending some time here, that's all." James laughed, clearly finding the situation surreal. "Here? Working as a waiter? What happened to you?" The sound of James's words seemed to echo through the restaurant. Alexander felt the stares of the other employees and, worse, those of Sophia, who was at the counter watching everything with a confused expression. "It's a long story," said Alexander, trying to keep his composure. James continued talking, laughing in a relaxed way, but every word felt like a blow to Alexander. When James finally left, the silence that remained was deafening. Alexander looked at Sophia, and the look in her eyes said it all. "So who are you really?" she asked, her voice low but full of intensity. He opened his mouth to answer but couldn't say anything. Sophia shook her head in disbelief. "I knew there was something strange about you, but I never thought it was that." And without waiting for an explanation, she left the restaurant, leaving Alexander alone in the middle of a truth that he didn't know how to fix. The restaurant door closed behind Sophia with a dry clang, but the sound echoed in Alexander's mind like thunder. He stood in the middle of the empty room, his gaze lost in the direction in which she had left, unable to process what had just happened. Everyone in the restaurant was staring at him. Maria, Tony, the few customers who were still finishing their meals. He felt the weight of the stares as if they were blades cutting into his skin. His heart was beating so fast that he could feel it pulsing in his ears. "So?" Tony's voice broke the silence, but sounded almost disinterested. "Are you going to clean up, or are you going to stand there like a ghost?" The words snapped him back to reality. He picked up the dishcloth with trembling hands and began to wipe down the nearest table, but his movements were mechanical, empty. The stares continued, but he no longer had the energy to care. He was crushed inside, shame burning every part of him. That night, as he walked back to the hostel, Alexander felt the cold of New York like never before. The city seemed bigger and more hostile, the streets darker, and the sound of the footsteps of the people around him seemed muffled. Sophia's words echoed in his head. "Who are you really?" He knew there was no simple answer to that question. He knew who he used to be. A cold, calculating man, shaped by wealth and power. And he knew who he was trying to be now, but who was he really? That was a question he couldn't answer. At the restaurant, things didn't get any better over the next few days. Maria, who had always been friendly, now treated him with an uncomfortable distance, as if she no longer knew what to think of him. Tony wasn't one to ask questions, but Alexander could sense the curiosity in the cook's eyes, as if he was waiting for some kind of explanation. Sophia didn't return to the restaurant. For the first few days, Alexander tried to convince himself that she needed time. But as the weeks passed, it became clear that she didn't want to see him. He felt her absence like a hole in his chest. Sophia wasn't just someone he talked to, she was the point of light in the midst of the chaos that his life had become. And now she was gone, because he had lied. One night, exhausted after a long shift, Alexander returned to the hostel and threw himself on the bed. He couldn't sleep. The peeling ceiling above him seemed almost like a screen on which his mind projected memories, moments with Sophia, her smile, the teasing tone of her voice. He also thought of his father, the mansion in London, the office where Thomas Hunt used to sit with that imposing posture. He could hear his father's voice in his head, repeating the words that had changed everything. "A man's worth is not in what he has, but in what he does." He closed his eyes, trying to push the pain away, but it wouldn't go away. A week later, as he finished washing the dishes at the end of his shift, Tony appeared in the kitchen, leaning on the counter. "So, have you thought about going after her?" asked the cook casually. Alexander stopped what he was doing and looked at Tony, confused. "Who are you talking about?" "Sophia, of course." Tony shrugged. "Isn't it obvious? You've been garbage ever since she stopped showing up." Alexander sighed, drying his hands with the cloth. "I don't know what to say to her." "How about starting with the truth?" suggested Tony, in a tone that seemed all too obvious. Alexander shook his head. "It's not that simple. Nothing ever is. But boy, you're making more drama than a Mexican soap opera. Do you like her or not?" Alexander didn't answer, but the silence was enough for Tony to understand. "Then go and tell her. Or are you going to spend the rest of your life hiding behind your own shame?" Tony left the kitchen, leaving Alexander alone. That night, Alexander finally plucked up the courage to go after Sophia. He knew where she lived because she had mentioned the neighborhood once, but the exact address was on a piece of paper she handed him when she suggested the restaurant. He found the crumpled piece of paper at the bottom of his suitcase, as if fate had saved that moment for when he was ready. When he arrived at her building, he hesitated to ring the intercom. It was dark and he could see the lighted windows above. He wondered what she was doing, if she still thought about him, if she hated him. Finally, he pressed the button, the sound of the intercom echoing in the silent night. Sophia's voice came from the other end, and he almost lost his words. "Who is it?" "It's me, Alexander." The silence that followed was long, and he was afraid that she would simply hang up. But then the gate clicked, unlocking. He climbed the stairs, feeling his heart beat so loudly that it seemed to echo in his ears. When she opened the door, her face was serious, but there was no anger, just something harder to decipher. "Why are you here?" she asked, crossing her arms. "I needed to talk to you," he said, his voice lower than he had intended. Sophia took a step back, making room for him to enter, but she didn't look comfortable. He entered, looking around. The apartment was small but cozy, with simple furniture and personal touches, books stacked in the corner, a scarf thrown over the sofa. "Well?" She stared at him, waiting. Alexander took a deep breath. "I know I made a mistake. I know I should have told you the truth from the start." "The truth about what? That you're a millionaire playing a pauper?" Her voice was sharp, but there was an underlying pain. "It wasn't a game." He shook his head, feeling his throat tighten. "I didn't want to cheat you, but you did." She took a step forward, her eyes shining. "And do you know what hurts the most? It's not just the lie, it's the fact that I trusted you, and I don't trust people easily, Alexander." He felt her words like a blow. Sophia had always seemed so strong, so unshakable, but now he saw the vulnerability she was hiding. "I know I made a mistake," he repeated sincerely, "and I know that apologies won't change anything. But please give me a chance to make it right." Sophia stared at him for a long moment, then shook her head. "It's not that simple." She walked away to the window and crossed her arms. Alexander stayed where he was, not knowing what else to say. The silence was heavy, almost unbearable. Finally, she spoke again, but without looking at him. "You should go, Alexander." He hesitated, but knew she wouldn't change her mind. He left the apartment feeling emptier than ever. Over the next few weeks, Alexander immersed himself in work. He couldn't fix the past, but he decided that he would do everything he could to prove that he was changing. He started helping Maria with deliveries outside of working hours, listened to Tony's advice and strove to be better at everything. But Sophia was still on his mind, like an open wound. He knew he only had one chance to win back her trust. And to do that, he would need to show her that the man she knew was real, even if that meant giving up what was left of his old self. The rain was falling heavily that morning, beating against the windows of the restaurant and forming irregular puddles on the sidewalk. Alexander cleared the tables, moving automatically, while his thoughts wandered. To the customers who came and went, he was just another employee in the frenetic bustle of New York. But for him, every day was a step in his transformation, a silent effort to rebuild who he was. Ever since Sophia had left him standing in the doorway of his apartment, something inside him had changed profoundly. He had spent weeks facing the pain of rejection and the shame of his lie. There were no shortcuts to righting wrongs. He knew he had to prove with actions, not words, that he was capable of being someone better. The first steps toward starting the community organization were marked by doubts and difficulties. Alexander didn't have much money, but he knew he had to start somewhere. He searched for information in community centers and met with local support groups. He discovered a small abandoned building in a poor neighborhood in New York, with peeling walls and a deteriorating structure, but which still had potential. The negotiation was complicated. Convincing the owner to rent the space for an affordable price required patience, something Alexander was only just beginning to learn. He shared his idea with Tony and Maria, who were the first to support the project. Tony, though cynical, offered immediate help. "I've got some old pans that still work, and I'll teach you some recipes so you don't embarrass anyone," he joked. Maria, for her part, mobilized her neighbors and friends to donate furniture, clothes, and toys. While working at the restaurant, Alexander dedicated his evenings and days off to cleaning and renovating the space. Every painted wall, every piece of furniture tidied up, seemed to be a way of atoning for past mistakes. However, there were times when he was consumed by insecurity. He wondered if he was doing it for the right reasons or just trying to prove something to himself, or perhaps to Sophia. Meanwhile, Sophia was also struggling with her own conflicts. She had heard rumors about what Alexander was doing, but avoided getting involved. After what had happened, she felt vulnerable and uncertain. She wanted to believe that his changes were genuine, but the hurt was still fresh, and the betrayal weighed heavy. Part of her wanted to ignore him completely and move on, but another part felt that there was something different about him, and that part made her hesitate. The day of the community organization's inauguration came faster than Alexander expected. He spent the morning organizing the tables, hanging makeshift banners, and helping the children put away the books that had been donated. Maria was in the kitchen, helping with the food, while Tony supervised everything in his grumpy way. The space was simple but welcoming, and Alexander felt a mixture of anxiety and satisfaction. When the event started, families began to arrive. The children ran around excitedly, exploring the small space while their parents chatted and tasted the food prepared by Tony. Alexander felt a lightness he hadn't experienced for a long time. For the first time, he was doing something that wasn't for himself, and this filled him with a silent pride. While he was helping a child put together a shelf for his books, he heard a voice behind him that paralyzed his body. He slowly turned around and found Sophia standing in the doorway, observing everything with a look he couldn't decipher. She was wearing a gray coat and holding a wet umbrella, her loose hair falling over her shoulders. "Was this all your idea?" she asked, her voice calm but full of curiosity. "It was," he replied hesitantly. "But I didn't do it alone. Maria and Tony helped a lot, and many people from the community too." Sophia looked around, seeing the tables full of toys, clothes, and food being distributed. The laughter of the children and the smiles of the volunteers seemed to create a contrast with the silence that hung between them. "It's impressive, Alexander," she said at last. "It's no big deal," he replied, looking away. "Just something I needed to do." "I think it is something," she replied with a soft smile. Alexander took a deep breath, feeling hope growing inside him, but also fear. He didn't want to rush anything. He didn't want to risk losing the chance to win back her trust. "I needed to change, not just for you, but for me," he said at last. Sophia stared at him, as if trying to decide whether she could believe him. The silence between them was heavy but not uncomfortable. It was a moment of evaluation, of exchanging unspoken feelings. "I know," she said, lowering her gaze. "And I can see that you've changed." Alexander felt his heart racing, but he didn't know what to say. He wanted to get closer, to say something that would erase all the pain she was carrying, but he knew that wouldn't be possible. Instead, he decided to wait for her to make her decision in her own time. Sophia stayed for a while, talking to Maria and helping to organize the donations that were still coming in. Alexander watched from a distance, feeling a mixture of nervousness and gratitude that she was there. He knew there was still a lot to do, but this moment was already a victory. When the event was over, Sophia approached him while he was clearing the tables. She was smiling, but there was something in her eyes that seemed different, softer. "You've done something good here, Alexander. I think your father would be proud." He stopped what he was doing and looked at her, surprised. Her words hit him with unexpected force, and he felt a lump in his throat. "Thank you, Sophia. That means a lot to me." They were silent for a moment, until she took a deep breath and said, "I'm not going to lie, Alexander. It's still hard for me to trust. But maybe you're right. Maybe everyone deserves a second chance." He didn't know if it was complete forgiveness, but for him, it was enough. Sophia held out her hand and he shook it, feeling that something important had changed between them. Over the next few weeks, Sophia became more involved in the organization. She helped him plan events, get more volunteers, and even look for funding. Little by little, the barrier between them was breaking down. It wasn't easy, but every day seemed to bring more trust, more connection. One afternoon, as they walked together through the streets of New York after a meeting, Sophia held his hand for the first time. Alexander looked at her, surprised, but she just smiled. "Let's not rush anything, okay?" she said with a twinkle in her eye. He nodded, feeling a peace he had never felt before. At that moment, Alexander knew he had learned the greatest lesson of his life. A man's true value lies not in what he possesses, but in what he is able to give to the world. The phone rang early one grey morning in New York. Alexander, sitting at the small wooden table in the hostel where he still lived. He answered without imagining that his life would change again in that instant. The voice on the other end was calm, but full of urgency. It was his father's assistant. "Mr. Hunt, your father wants to see you. He's in hospital in London." The news hit Alexander like a punch. He had tried to contact his father a few times over the months, but his father had never returned. Pride or poor health prevented it, and Alexander accepted that perhaps his father wanted to keep his distance. Now, the sudden call made him tense and uneasy. He went to the restaurant where he worked and told the manager, Tony and Maria, that he had to leave. They understood immediately. "Go on, kid," said Tony with a tired smile. "London needs you now." "We'll take care of everything here," added Maria, touching Alexander's arm with a reassuring gesture. Before leaving, Alexander went to Sophia. He knew he needed her, even if she had kept her distance since everything had happened. "My father is in hospital in London," he said as they walked through a square. "He wants to see me and I want you to go with me." Sophia stopped, surprised. "London? Alexander, I don't know. Please, I don't know. I know we're still working things out between us, but you always said you wanted to see England. Besides, I don't want to do it alone." She hesitated. It hadn't been easy for her to accept what Alexander had kept from her in the past. But looking at him now, there was something different. He wasn't trying to impress her. He was vulnerable. "I'll go. I'm going." The plane landed in London under cloudy skies, the kind of weather that Alexander had always considered commonplace, but which Sophia found fascinating. They passed through the busy streets of the city, and she observed everything with curiosity. The historic buildings, the black cabs, the buses, the unique rhythm of a metropolis so different from New York. When they arrived at the hospital, Alexander felt his heart squeeze. It had been almost a year since he had left London, but it felt like an eternity. His father was in a private room, hooked up to machines that monitored every heartbeat, every breath. Thomas Hunt was thinner, his eyes deeper, but his gaze still carried that intensity that Alexander knew so well. "Alexander," said his father, his voice weak but firm. "Father." Alexander approached, holding his hand carefully. They were silent for a moment, their eyes meeting. There was so much to be said, but no words seemed enough. Finally, Alexander began to speak. "You were right. About everything." He took a deep breath, feeling his throat tighten. "When you sent me to New York, I thought it was a punishment, but now I see it was a gift. You gave me the chance to discover who I am." Thomas's eyes sparkled, and he squeezed his son's hand lightly. "And what did you discover? That money means nothing if we have no purpose. That the people around us, the connections we create, are what really matter. I learned to live, Dad, and it's all because of you. Thank you." Alexander's tears finally fell, and Thomas, with difficulty, raised his hand to touch his son's face. "You're my greatest work, Alexander," he said with a small smile. "I always thought that a man's legacy lay in what he built. But I was wrong. The real legacy is in the people we touch, in the lives we help to improve." Alexander swallowed, holding his father's hand even tighter. "I would never have understood that without you." "No, my son." Thomas looked at him with love and pride. "You understood because you had it in you all along. I just pushed you onto the right path." Silence filled the room as Thomas closed his eyes. His breathing became slower, and Alexander felt the world around him crumble. "Dad, you're ready for the world, Alexander. Live with purpose." And with those words, he took his last breath and left in peace. Sophia, who was standing by the door, put her hand to her mouth, trying to hold back the tears. She had never seen Alexander so vulnerable, so human. As she watched him embrace his father's inert body, tears flowed freely. Alexander was someone who had lost everything and, in the process, found himself. The next few days were a roller coaster of emotions. Alexander had to deal with his grief while taking control of the company. He knew he couldn't go back to New York, at least not yet, but his heart was still divided. The night before Sophia returned alone to the United States, Alexander took her for a walk through the gardens of the Hunt mansion. It was a place he had never appreciated before, but which now seemed full of meaning. "Sophia, I know you have your life in New York, and I know that I've lied to you in the past, but since I met you, everything about me has changed." She looked at him, saying nothing, but her eyes shone in the soft moonlight. "I can't go back with you now, but I don't want you to leave. I want you to stay here, with me." "Alexander, I love you, Sophia. Not because of who you made me, but because you saw something in me when I didn't see it myself. I want to live this life with you." For a moment, Sophia was silent, absorbing his words. Then, with tears in her eyes, she moved closer and kissed him, sealing the promise that they both knew would change everything. In the months that followed, Alexander dedicated himself to running the company, but always keeping to the purpose he had discovered. He and Sophia transformed the Hunt empire into something more human, closer to the people. They regularly sent funds to the community project in New York, now run by Tony and Maria, who continued to help people in the neighborhood where it all began. Finally, the day came to return to New York to visit the project. When Alexander and Sophia entered the community center, they were greeted by a warm hug from Maria and a playful greeting from Tony. "Look who's back, the repentant millionaire," said Tony, laughing as he hugged Alexander. The children who frequented the center ran to greet them, and Alexander found himself surrounded by smiles and laughter. He looked around, seeing all that had been built, and felt a wave of pride and gratitude. That evening, as everyone celebrated together, Alexander realized that he had finally found what he had always been looking for: a purpose, a family, and the value of things that money couldn't buy. He held Sophia's hand, smiling at her. "My father was right. The real legacy is in the lives we touch." And at that moment, Alexander knew that he was exactly where he should be. Thomas Hunt's legacy was complete. And most importantly, Alexander had found his own legacy. Did you like Alexander and Sophia's story? Leave a rating from 0 to 10 in the comments and tell us what moved you most about their journey. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel to help us keep bringing you impactful stories like this one. Your opinion makes all the difference.